Thank you for joining us today at this DecisionWise webinar. My name is Justin Warner, and I'm excited to be our host for this web. Today, our topic is 360-degree feedback coaching best practices in 2021. And I am fortunate to be joined today by two DecisionWise senior consultants and members of the DecisionWise executive team, David Long and Christian Nielson. So, gentlemen, thank you so much for being with us today.
Yeah, happy to be here.
Thanks.
Great. Well, this webinar, along with all of our other webinars, can be viewed on demand on our website or on this particular Bright Talk channel. In conjunction with this webinar, DecisionWise has released several new features on our 360-degree feedback platform for administering and running 360 programs. So please watch for information about product demo webinars that will be coming up in the near future. And then lastly, we are still in some different locations. And so if we do speak over each other, we apologize for that. But now, Christian, Dave, I'm going to turn the time over to you and let's get this thing going.
All right. Thanks, Justin. This is Dave Long. I'm joined with Christian Nielson. It's good to have both of us on this particular webinar because we are talking about coaching best practices and especially best practices in coaching in 360. And one of the things that we know about coaching is that I think every coach's approach to a coaching conversation will vary a little bit depending on their style, on who they are, on kind of their personality and that sort of a thing. And that's okay, but it'll be good to have the perspective of two of us today to kind of talk through our own experiences and try to help you understand some of the best practices that we've discovered over the years in Coaching 360. The agenda today, we're going to talk about a few things. First, want to talk about just in general, what does it mean to be a coach? We want to talk about some guiding principles that we use or that we abide by when we have our coaching conversations. And then we want to flip the conversation from general coaching to coaching with an assessment. And specifically, we're going to be talking about coaching on 360 assessments. So 360 coaching tools, creating a coaching focal point, helping with the analysis of a report, and ultimately guiding action planning will be things that we cover today in this discussion. Why don't we start with the definition of coaching? And we often will go back to the International Coaching Federation, ICF, and really try to understand how they define it. The way that they define coaching is that it's partnering with clients in a thought-provoking and creative process that inspires them to maximize their personal and professional growth. I'm going to let Christian talk a little bit here about some of the guiding principles that we at DecisionWise, we kind of use as we go into a coaching conversation. This guides us a little bit. So let's talk about the first one, which is creating safety. Christian, what does that mean?
Yeah, and just some thoughts on this slide that we're going to walk through, just some high-level principles. If you take nothing else away from this, if you do these key things, you can lead to a pretty great outcome for your coaching experience. So first one we've got here, create safety. It's a vulnerable thing to enter into a coaching conversation, especially when you have a formal feedback report like we're going to be talking about today with 360. And so it's important for a coach to create safety right from the start of the process. You can do this even before the start in the way you introduce, hey, you're going to be part of a 360 experience, and the way the program is set up and how we do things like pre-webinars and things like that to set a tone and communicate where the results will be shared. But especially in that coaching conversation to create safety, for example, the way you introduce yourself and define your role. This is my role in the conversation, who I'll be sharing the results with and who I won't. Ideally, if you can, state something along the lines of, this is really your conversation. Everything we discuss will be, held confidential. It's purely for your development, if that's the intent of the program. Things that you can do early in that conversation and throughout the conversation to create safety, really open up possibilities for growth and development in that conversation.
I like the point you make about what we do ahead of time as well to create safety, because if you're a coach and you're running through a bunch of these coaching sessions with different leaders or executives in an organization, then you want to make sure that it's administered in the right way. So for example, if you're collecting 360-degree feedback and you're saying, hey, this is for your development, we're going to have these coaching confidential conversations, but then it's found out that, oh, by the way, everybody in HR is going to have a copy of your report, and your manager is going to have a copy of your report, and the CEO is going to have a copy of the report, and we're going to send one to your mom just for safekeeping. If we do all those things, then we're kind of communicating, okay, yeah, but you're being evaluated in a much more stringent way than maybe we communicated up front. And now all of a sudden they don't feel as safe in that coaching conversation. But if you communicate through your actions that it is for development, that you're saying, look, you own your report, you can share it with whomever you want, but ultimately you own the report and you own the direction of this, that creates a much safer coaching environment for me to then allow that client, as we're going to call that person that we're coaching, that allow that client to open up.
Yep, definitely. Next one is be present. And my icon game is strong. That's a present. To be present. What's interesting is, and one thing, is we talk about, and when we certify coaches on our instrument, one of my favorite questions is to ask is, when was the last time someone spent 90 minutes just focused on you? It is a rare gift to have a coaching session where someone is completely present and invested in your success and development and growth, and as you're exploring this feedback. And it seems like such a simple thing, but it's such a critical skill to be present. You're not distracted by your phone or whatever other thing might be vying for your attention, or you're not distracted with the temptation to tell your own stories or make the session more about you, or some of the things we'll chat about a little bit as we go further. But being present, focused on the client, so critical, and really elevates the experience for the client as they're being coached.
Yeah, and I think that all the things that we've ever learned about active listening apply here, which is we're listening fully to understand as we're present, and not necessarily formulating our next response to what they're saying. We're listening and really trying to understand their perspective.
The next area here is kind of ties into that. When you're present, along with that, also staying very curious. Those of you with coaching backgrounds know what it's like to have multiple coaching sessions in a single day, especially if they're back to back. Being present and also staying curious and interested in the person sometimes it can be a little bit of a challenge, but it's so key and critical to success. One thing I've learned, and we're going to talk about the difference between a coach and a consultant, is one of the things that's so freeing and empowering and makes a better coach is realizing that you don't have to have all the answers, but you've got to have the right questions and you've got to stay curious. And so paying attention to the person, staying interested in the person, and actively curious, exploring the feedback with the individual, very key. So create safety, be present, stay curious, high-level guiding principles that will really open up some strong possibilities when you're coaching sessions.
And of course, these are principles for all coaching, not just for coaching with a 360, but these are any coaching conversation you ever have. And I don't care if you're doing formalized coaching or if you're a manager and doing a check-in with one of your employees. I think these are really great principles to use in even those conversations.
Yep, good point.
Okay, let's talk about how coaching is different. So we're going to go through 3 different types of a person that would have one-on-one conversations with another human being. Let's start with the first one, which is a therapist. So a therapist is someone who is an expert at assessing mental health. They often are looking for diagnoses that drive intervention, and the interventions are usually aimed at improving mental health. Oftentimes they're focused on the past and what is causing what they're feeling or what they're going through now. And the goal is to become functional. So a therapist, oftentimes as coaches, we kind of walk the line between, am I a coach or am I a therapist? Where do you see that differential happen, Christian?
Yeah, well, what's interesting, and we've worked with many coaches throughout the years, and some of them have a clinical background and can kind of feel more comfortable and licensed to go on the other side. Most of us don't have that background, and occasionally you'll bump into those areas where we're talking about something that goes outside the scope of a coach, outside the scope of, especially when we're in a specific 360 conversation. And it's important to make sure you are watching and understand when those boundaries when they come up. And also say, we're getting into an area that's more aligned with mental health, or something that would be more appropriate for you to discuss with someone in a therapy setting, and just call that out occasionally when we bump into those.
Yeah, and I think a guideline is if you're getting into traumatic childhood experiences and things like that, which people are willing to talk about in these conversations, that might be a time where you might look at this and say, am I the right person to help this person in this situation? Right. Second thing, and this is one where Christian and I have a little more difficulty walking the line between being a coach or a consultant. Christian and I are both consultants. We consult on organizational issues. We're asked to bring expertise to situations. And that's what consultants really do. They provide solutions. They give answers to problems. They analyze problems. They are focused very much on what's going on presently and how to improve present performance. They're actively giving advice. And consultants are also often held accountable for the outcome of what happens. So the difference now then is we look at going from therapist to consultant to coach. What's the difference between a consultant and a coach?
Yeah, and I love that you point out this is the line where you and I often struggle a bit, because the answer is in the consultant. We're paid to give advice and to have a point of view when we're in that consultant role. As a coach, the answer is in the client. The client is the expert on the client. I often, part of building that safety in the way I introduce myself on calls is I mention, I'm an expert in employee feedback and the instrument we're talking about, but you're the expert in you. And do that for the client, but I also do it just to remind myself that I'm there to help them explore and to just be a thought partner as we go down the path of understanding the feedback and the experience they're creating, where their opportunities lie. And it's a very different hat to wear. And occasionally, even in a session, if I get asked something specific, I'll mention, I'm going to put on my consultant hat for just a moment before we go back into coach. Occasionally a client will say, here's what I've tried. What do you recommend? Mm-hmm. And a very specific call out for an answer. And in those cases, I might step into consultant. But the majority of your time, you should really be focused in the answers in the client. You're there to help draw that out, facilitate growth and discovery.
I've got sort of a consultant mindset when I'm coaching. I get in my mind, I'm hearing somebody describe a problem they have, and I'm like, I know the answer. Yeah. I've got it. Yeah. I know exactly what to tell this person. But then I stay disciplined enough to say, well, what do you think you should do?
Right.
And they come in with an answer that I never thought of that sounds way better than whatever I was going to say. I mean, really, you need those experiences to really understand that it's true. The answer is in the client.
Right.
The answer is in the person that you are coaching. And as a coach, by staying curious and by staying present, you really are able to draw some of those answers out of that person. So when you flip from a consulting conversation to a coaching conversation, you really have to change your whole mindset around. Another thing that I love when we talk about coaches is that they're future focused. Mm-hmm. In other words, what am I going to do now? We're not so worried about what was in the past. I mean, we can use some of the feedback that we received from the past to kind of inform what we do in the future. But coaches are very much pointing somebody in the forward direction as opposed to having them in reverse. Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about the difference between coaching just for the sake of coaching and assessment-based coaching. And we're really here to talk about best practices with coaching with 360. So let's talk about when we have an assessment. And by the way, 360s are not the only assessments that we have coached on. We've done it with psychometric assessments. One of the ones we love is MBTI, Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, Hogan assessment. We've coached on all kinds of different assessments, but today we're here to talk about 360. It's one of my favorite assessments to coach on, mostly because when we're talking about a 360, we're talking about the perceptions of other people. If I'm coaching on an MBTI, we're talking about how you're hardwired. But here we're talking about things that are really changeable and malleable. So let's talk about the difference. So if I'm just being a coach, I'm maybe using more of an emergent style. I'm letting the client guide the conversation. We're seeing where the momentum of the conversation takes us. And based on that momentum, that's what we'll end up talking about and coaching on, which is a great way, great approach. Obviously, it takes a lot of skill to coach in that way. Now, when a client receives an assessment, like a 360 assessment, they're probably going to find it interesting and they'll find it helpful on its own. But oftentimes, to really get them focused on what's most important in that assessment, they need coaching to help. So as we think about our role, we want to make sure that we're using that assessment as an integral part of our conversation. But we want to keep in mind, okay, the client is still the expert on the client. They are the expert on themselves. And the coach is the expert on the assessment. So really get to know your assessment, understand the ins and outs of it, but you're going to be the expert on the assessment, but we're still going to take that coach approach with regard to the client and just have that mindset. We're going to stay curious. We're going to stay open to what they have to say, and we're going to let them be the expert on themselves.
Great points. And one thing I might also add to that is a client getting an assessment, and I've been on both sides of this. I get my own 360 assessment, and I know, even though I spend so much time in on the coaching side, I know that when I receive my assessment, if I don't have someone to process this through it with and to kind of have a guide, I can take it to some dark places. And so Part of the coach is to recognize, but you're there to be a guide to help them get to a healthy and productive place with this feedback. But great points in terms of the answer still in the client. You're there as a guide.
So let's talk specifically about coaching with 360. A 360, I think most of you know what a 360 is, but the way that we view it is it's a purpose-built disruption. In other words, we're causing a disruption for somebody by presenting them with 360 results, but it creates the opportunity for increased self-awareness and change. So we're getting all this feedback from everybody that we know well or work with closely, and it's giving us an opportunity to step back and say, how do we move forward with this information? So let's talk about some of the tools that we use. A 360 is such an interesting thing because we're gathering perspectives of other people. We're gathering their perceptions rather than trying to identify exactly who you are. Like a psychometric assessment is going to say, this is who you are and this is who you always will be. But a 360 is going to say, this is how you're perceived currently. And so when we understand that, then we can start using some tools to try to guide our clients. This is one of my favorite tools, and it's a 2x2 matrix developed by Joseph Luft and Harry Ingham. Joe Harry window is what they called it. It sounds a little more exotic than I think it actually is. But we have these basically 4 categories. So we have things that we learn on a 360 that we feel like we already knew. So we see something on a feedback on a 360 and I'm like, I already knew that. I didn't need a 360 to tell me. And there were some things that you'll see on a 360 that you didn't know about yourself. And conversely, you'll discover some things on a 360 that other people knew about you and some things that other people didn't know about you. And so if we overlay those on top of each other, we get these 4 categories. The first one is these things that I discover on a 360 that I already knew and that everybody else already knew too. And we call that arena. And the way I view that is if you're standing in the middle of a 20,000 person arena where everybody's looking at you, there's nowhere to hide. These are things that you know are your strengths or weaknesses. Other people know them as your strengths or weaknesses. You all agree. You didn't need the 360 in order for you to really understand that. Then we get into some more nuanced areas, things that I knew about myself that maybe other people didn't. Maybe you know about yourself that you struggle keeping your email inbox up to date, or you know about yourself that you struggle making it to meetings on time, or whatever it might be, right? If other people are not pointing that out in the 360, it means that you have maintained an effective facade. You've been able to fool everybody else into thinking, hey, you're at least good at this. Now, that may be other people, you may be okay with that. Other people perceive you as good enough in an area. You may feel like, okay, I fooled them enough and I can continue this charade going forward and therefore I don't need to work on it. Or you may look at that and say, yeah, I know other people think I'm okay at this, but I really, for my own purposes, want to improve this.
And sometimes they can even be positive things.
Yeah, definitely.
I know I'm a really great public speaker, but I don't ever, that hasn't come out in this setting or this experience. And so it's something that, I might want to explore or look for opportunities to get that out there.
This is such a critical part of the coaching conversation, because how do we know if you have identified something that you're really good at and other people disagree? How do we know who's right? How do we know who's right? And that's kind of the conversation between not known to self or known to others. Am I identifying here a facade or a blind spot? Because what we have is disagreement in the way I see myself and the way other people see me. And I think it really requires strong coaching for us to identify, is this a blind spot or is it just a facade? I'll give you a really good example of this. I was working with a leader a few months ago who was really uncomfortable in times of crisis and thought of himself as somebody that was really poor at crisis management. And so what we found out, though, from the feedback was that he had a lot of positive feedback about how he operates in the time of a crisis. And so we have disagreement. People are saying, you're really good at this. And he's saying, well, I'm not very good at it. I feel really uncomfortable in times of crisis. But as we talked about it and had the coaching conversation, and I asked questions and stayed curious, what I really found out was, in fact, he was really effective. Everybody feels a certain way in times of crisis. Everybody feels a little bit of anxiety. But the way that he operates and the way that he analyzes and thinks critically in times of crisis really helps everybody else get through the crisis. And so what he thought was a facade really turned out to be a positive blind spot, meaning other people are telling him he's great in times of crisis. Now he can show up more in times, probably doesn't want to create his own crises in order to prove that. But when there is a time of crisis, he can step forward and say, hey, I got this, everybody, I can help. Right. So it's really an interesting and powerful conversation we can have with people to help them understand, hey, maybe this thing that everybody's saying is a strength, maybe it's actually a strength. And of course, that's a positive example. The flip side of that could be that, hey, this thing that you don't think is a weakness, maybe it's really getting in the way of you being successful. The other thing is that the 360 doesn't cover everything. And so there may be some things that you didn't know about yourself and there aren't known to others, but you may still discover that in a coaching conversation. As you talk and you kind of uncover other things, you may be able to look at the unknown. But a lot of the value of 360 coaching is going to help people identify those blind spots and facades and ultimately some of the things that they don't know that aren't covered in 360. One of our best practice tools that we would maybe recommend is the Sarah model. And it's really, how do we expect people to respond to feedback? And it's interesting because when we go into a 360 coaching conversation, very often we'll have the report ahead of time and we'll look at the report and we'll try to guess what is going to be the reaction. So very high scores across the board, we try to guess what's the reaction here, or very low scores, we kind of brace ourselves. But what I've found is I can never really predict 100% accuracy how somebody's going to react in a coaching situation. So I have to be ready or equipped with the tools to understand, even if somebody had really high scores, there still could be an element of surprise. So we look for shifts in energy. If somebody is surprised by a result in their assessment, it may look like this. It may be, hey, this is a positive surprise. This is great. Their energy goes up in a positive way. But it could be that I can't believe that my direct reports think of me this way. Could be a really low score. And that surprise, that negative surprise, the energy goes up in a negative way. We call that anger. And it doesn't mean people are throwing chairs or punching holes in walls or anything like that. It can be a very silent frustration that they're feeling, but they will nevertheless feel that and feel kind of a spike in energy. And as their energy comes down, they get into the state that we call resistance. And often this is where we meet people. If they're in the Sarah model and we're in the coaching conversation, we'll meet them. They'll be surprised. They go, energy comes up, their anger goes up, and they come back down to a place of resistance where they're essentially saying, well, what can I do about this? Why does this even matter? Or this process is stupid, or whatever it might be. So we meet them in that place of resistance. And the idea in the coaching conversation is we want to get them from that low energy state of resistance back to a higher energy state of feeling like, hey, there's something I can do here. I really feel like I can improve in the future. And we call that acceptance.
Yeah. Well, I like the Sarah model because it gives you a roadmap to say, how do I get this person or help this person on their journey from surprise to acceptance, and getting into a healthy and productive outcome with this. And sometimes it's a blink of an eye. Mm-hmm. We'll see people and something, one point of feedback hits them that you go through all of this very quickly. And sometimes they'll show up to your session in anger and they'll leave in anger. And it's going to take them a little more time to process. That's obviously not the ideal, but we are trying to get them to a place of acceptance and optimism for, I can use this feedback and I've got some sense of direction for the next steps to be successful with this.
And obviously, different coaches will have different approaches to doing that, but we kind of look at just a really quick, by way of process, how can we get them from that kind of maybe a resistance or an anger phase into the place where they're accepting and willing to work. And the first thing that we can do is recenter their focus. And these are really small, I know that, but we're going to go through each of these individually. But we want to create a focus somewhere for them to focus their analysis instead of just looking at the things that are really bugging them in the report. We really want to think of what are the most productive things to look at the report. We want to help them analyze. Sometimes somebody will come in really angry about something because they got what they think is a really low score, but it's really quite a high score, a really above average score. And we can talk to them about how to analyze it. And this is where it's really helpful for you to be the expert on the assessment that you're using. But the biggest thing I think that we can do is help them prioritize, get their priorities so they're down to 1, 2, or 3 things that they're working on. Really narrow their focus so they're not trying to boil the whole ocean. They're just taking small incremental steps and saying, this is one thing, this is a second thing. And maybe if they really want to, we go to a third thing. But oftentimes we're just saying, let's improve upon one or two things. And ultimately, once we prioritize, we can help them action plan. So we're going to talk about all those things today. Let's get into creating focus areas. And I want to just have a quick conversation with Christian about this. Very often, somebody gets a 360 report and they focus on their lowest scores. And you as a coach might be tempted to guide the conversation to, let's focus on where did you score low. So let me ask you this question, Christian. What makes sense about that approach?
Lowest items might be a big distraction. It might be the areas where we have the greatest opportunity, or they might be critically aligned with our success, or things that are getting in the way of the otherwise very positive things that we're doing.
Mm-hmm. And what would be the risks?
Well, what we find is that if you're only focused on the lowest score, you're missing the bigger picture. Just because something scores low, it doesn't necessarily mean it's your most strategic opportunity. It might not be aligned to some longer term goals or things that you're trying to accomplish. For example, accountants. If I'm in accounting, innovation and creativity might not be the leading competency. And so my score might be low on that, but it's low because we asked a question about it. It doesn't necessarily mean my supervisor, my peers, my direct reports are really looking for a higher performance. It's just that's the way it shook out because the item was there. So it's important to at least consider that, because you could be missing the real opportunities, the strategic opportunities, if you're only focused on the lowest scores.
The other thing that I see as a risk of focusing on just the lowest scores is, and I'll give you an example of this, sometimes a low score can be representative of the strength that's happening somewhere else. So I was working with a leader like maybe a month or two ago where her greatest strength was collaboration. Everybody valued her ability to bring different parties together, synthesize their thoughts, synthesize all the information, and make great decisions. But sometimes it took a little longer for her to make decisions. So one of her first things coming to me was, I've got to be more decisive. I've got to be quicker in the decision-making process. But as we, again, staying curious and staying open to where the conversation goes, what we found out is the reason why she's a little slower is because of her strong collaboration skills. So we were faced with, do we sacrifice this thing that everybody loves about you, that everybody really values about you? And do we focus instead on this thing that's maybe scored a little bit lower? Right. Didn't score super low, just scored a little bit lower. And so the answer for her was certainly not to do that. Like, let's not sacrifice one of my greatest strengths to quote unquote fix a perceived weakness. So that's one of the biggest risks, in my opinion, is we need to understand that, different parts of these reports kind of play together. And I'm doing something poorly in one area, I squeeze the balloon and the air goes to another area. They are all connected. So we want to make sure that we understand that. There's a second philosophy for coaching out there that I think we definitely use at times, which is getting clients to refocus their attention on their strengths. What makes sense about this approach?
Well, it's a strengths-based approach, right? We hear a lot about this, which is what got you here. Let's lean into the areas, the things that have made you successful. And there's a lot of merit to that. Well, this is when we ask for feedback, we're not only asking what could be improved, we're asking what's working well. What do we want to lean into? What do we want to celebrate and protect going forward? And so there's some real value in understanding this is kind of one of my competitive advantages, something I bring to my role or to the organization, to the team, that type of thing.
Understanding your own brand, even, right?
Yeah, exactly.
What are the risks?
Well, the risks are you could completely ignore, if you're only seeing the sunshine, perhaps you're missing some glaring weakness or something that is really detracting or limiting your success. And so you can't only look at where the sun is shining. You've got to also focus on where there's some areas that are maybe blind spots or things that you aren't necessarily excelling at.
It's really interesting. Probably 90% of the time you have somebody that comes to you that has what we call a negativity bias. In other words, they're focused only on the most negative in the report, and that's what they want to talk about. Right. And then the other 10% of the time, it's not really that balanced. It goes from either I'm focused on only the negative, or I've got a complete ego defense happening,
Yeah.
which is like, I only see positive things here and this is great. And sometimes we have to help that person also see, okay, yeah, but you're maybe falling short in an area.
Yeah, and there's some urgency. That's the interesting thing. Sometimes there's a really low scoring report and I go in thinking, oh boy, this person's going to be devastated. And you get on the call and they're like, oh, I feel pretty great about this. You see this one comment? And, and it's, how do I ask questions to facilitate just the realization that this might not be a productive path.
And, I think early in our days in DecisionWise, we really tried to be more strengths-based and everything like that. And I think we still try to do that. That's definitely something we incorporate, but we want to take a balanced approach. And here's something that we use now, which has been very effective in our coaching conversations. So when we talk about best practices, this is a best practice for us. Before we even get into the report or even touch any of the results of the report, it's helpful to start the conversation simply by asking, hey, over the next 6 to 12 months, what are the things that you're really trying to accomplish? What are the most important things that you want to do over the next 6 to 12 months? And that starts a conversation, especially when you're working with a leader that says, I'm rebuilding my team. I'm really going to have to hire people. Or I've got a low performing team and really need to focus on bringing up low performers and getting them up to snuff. Or they might say, we're going through a major change or we're implementing a major software change over the next 6 to 12 months. But it gets them focused instead of on what's scoring low in the report, on what they're working on and what's most important to them and what they need to do to be successful over the next year.
It also just really changes the tone of the conversation. So depending on why the 360s are being run, the leader could be viewing this experience from different views. Like, this is something that's being done to me and I have to do this. But as soon as you say, what are you trying to accomplish? And this whole conversation is steered around helping you succeed in this thing that's important to you. Then it's something that's being done for them, and they engage in the conversation to a greater degree. So this change in approach has really unlocked the coaching sessions for us here at DecisionWise.
Yeah, and so that helps us to prioritize, right? So we've recentered the focus to now what's most important to you. So it helps us prioritize, and we can now talk about, okay, what are the most important or most relevant competencies based on what you want to accomplish? And it may not be their lowest scoring items. It may not be their highest scoring items. It may be something right in the middle. And then we can talk about, all right, but is there anything that's getting in the way of you being successful? And this is where it's really helpful to understand the report. Because in our report on a 7-point scale, we don't really pay attention to anything unless it's below. If you don't know the report, then maybe you don't know that. But for us, in our reports, we're looking for things that are scored below a 4 out of 7 on the 7-point scale. And so we're looking for glaring weaknesses, things that could be really derailing their career. Then we'll also make sure that we talk about areas of strength. There's any way to leverage or develop them more. Then maybe we talk about some of the gaps in perceptions. Maybe your peers perceive you a little bit worse than other people do. And then if we still need something to work on after all that, we've already, if we still don't have 1, 2, or 3 things to work on, then maybe we'll look at some of the other low scoring competencies. And that's really the way that we go. What's most important? Is there anything getting in the way of your success? Is there a way for us to utilize your strengths more? Usually by the time we get there, we've got 1, 2, or 3 focus areas that the person feels really comfortable with. So I'll give you an example of this really quickly. In a coaching conference, this is an example of a chart that we have in our 360 reports. But this is a chart where if I sat down for a coaching conversation and just asked what's most important on this page, somebody would automatically say, well, managing change in communication, I've got to improve at that. But if I did this and I said, let's cover up the scores and said, okay, given what we've just talked about, the one or 2 things that are most important to you. And let's say that person said, well, I've got to develop my team. I'm hiring a bunch of new people. Then in this case, that person might say, the 2 most important things here are leading others and performance management. And if we go back and look again and see, okay, leading others and performance management, those aren't the lowest scoring items on here, but they're the things that are most important. And they're not the highest scoring items either, but they're things that maybe this person wants to address and work on because those are the things that are most important given what he's trying to accomplish. So I do want to talk about focusing on strengths, because if you do have somebody in that negativity bias, it can be helpful to ask some really pointed questions to maybe try to draw out some of their strengths. And besides just saying, what do you see as a strength here? You might also ask questions like, how have your strengths made you successful? How does this make you a valuable contributor? How are you adding value to whatever team or work group that you're leading? How are you adding value? What's the value that you bring? And how can you better leverage the strengths?
And sometimes if they're completely in that negativity bias. They're not seeing the strengths at all. I'll even ask, as I look through your report, I see a real strength in collaboration and communication. Is that something that you're seeing? How do you view that? Calling out some areas, and I always say it's my job to help them wallow in the positive a little bit, because they will skip those things. And these are some great questions to help further that.
It's interesting because oftentimes somebody will just get stuck on a one little part, and just asking them some open-ended questions and getting them out of their fight or flight response. Asking some open-ended critical thinking questions like these can help them kind of refocus and get out of that sort of anger resistance phase and into a more productive conversation. We brought this in, obviously we want to be able to be, we've said it before, you need to be an expert on the report that you're coaching on, just because people will have questions, and you'll want to be able to bring insights to that conversation when we're coaching using a report. For example, if I were to show somebody this report, I might go through here and say, there's a pretty big gap here between the way that your peers see you and the way that your, for example, manager sees you and your ability to adjust priorities and changing situations. Or I might just say, overall, it looks like your peers are scoring you lower. What's different about your relationship with your peers, or how are your peers seeing you show up differently in these situations than maybe these other groups are? And you might even ask questions like, hey, if you're working on managing change, what role do your peers play in that? And how do you associate with them, or how do you bring them into the change process? So questions like that to help them kind of think through this.
And I think that it goes, hopefully this is connecting the dots on why being present and curious is so important. You can naturally just follow your curiosity through these reports. I know that managing change is important for this leader. We're seeing this gap with the peer. The question kind of writes itself.
Absolutely. Okay, really quickly, and this will be the last thing that we cover, and then we'll get into your questions. We'll see what questions are out there. I wanted to talk about, because I think, when we're coaching on an assessment, oftentimes, and if you're an HR leader or HR business partner or a coach within your organization, the organization is running a 360 on people because they really are hoping that they will be able to take the information and make change with it. And so it's important for you, and all these steps that we talk about when we're coaching on an assessment, we want to try to, again, reframe their focus, help them prioritize, but ultimately the goal is that we want to help them really create an effective action plan. So one way to do that is we're kind of going through and talking about the report and identifying different things, is to kind of be open to some things that maybe if they are looking through the report, there's some things that they maybe don't understand. They lack information. They see something, they see their manager scores them low in an area and they don't really understand that. And that's okay. And we might say to them, there's no way for us to answer this question together in this coaching conversation. Let's put this into explore, an explore category where you're going to have further conversations about this in the future. And then there are other things that where they say, I know other people disagree with me, but I think they lack information. We put this into an explain category. So others lack information, meaning that I need to either go out there and explain things, or explain through my actions. Hey, I really do know how to do this. I really am, to your point, to your example, a great public speaker, and I can show that. Right. So we put that in the explain category. There are other things where I have the information I need. I agree, they agree, and we are ready to execute. We're ready to action plan. When we get to some of those items, then we start thinking about how do we put together an effective action plan. And you're going to see some of these things that I'm going to talk about here look very familiar. They look like SMART goals. SMART goals are kind of a little bit harder to really be religiously true to the SMART goal in situations where we're improving soft skills. So we still want our goals to be attainable. We want them to be specific. We want them to be time bound. We want them to be specific and attainable. We also want to make sure that if we're working on soft skills, we want to make sure that we're allowing for them to practice. Do you have a mentor that you can work with? Do you have somebody that you can kind of role play with? Can you plan practice into your normal thing? Can you make time for evaluation of how you did when you're able to practice those things? And we also want to make sure that when we're measuring success, we can certainly measure it with a follow-up 360, and we can get qualitative measures of success. And we're making sure we can measure that we are following that process for change. And so we can measure process successes as much as we can measure, outcome successes here. So here's an example of an ineffective action plan. If I'm going to improve the feedback I give to my team, and we see this kind of thing all the time, a one-line action plan. Oh, okay. If somebody gave you that as their action plan, what questions would you have for them in a coaching conversation, Christian?
Well, yeah, my first thing is I look forward to that same goal next year, because it's none of the things you just described for a good goal, which, so my first question is how, what specifically, or I even become even more specific in my question. I'll say, what are you going to do by the end of this week to do that?
Mm-hmm.
Or what are you going to have done in 30 days? And so sometimes just the follow-up question, if you put a time limit on it, it forces them to get more specific and to say, well, I don't even know how to give feedback, so I'm going to find a resource. Or sometimes I'll direct them that way through a question. I'll say, who do you know who's really great at feedback? And can you ask them? Or what can you learn from them? And would it be worth setting up an appointment in the next day or two just to pick their brain on this thing? But as it's written, it's not going to lead to any meaningful change. I've seen so many just general, high, broad level statements that don't really lead to any meaningful action.
So here's some of the questions I thought of, and some of them align with yours, like when do you want to accomplish this?
Yeah.
Let's put some time limits to your point. What are you going to do in 30 days?
Right.
What can you have done in 3 months? What have you? Second thing would be, give me some steps. What's the first step? What's the second step, third step, et cetera? Another would be, okay, that's not very specific. Are you improving how often you give feedback to your team, or are you wanting to improve the quality of the feedback that you give to your team? And those are two separate goals. Where will you go for ongoing feedback? In other words, how will you know that you've improved? Who's going to give you the feedback that says, hey, you were really great in this situation? And then the last one would be, how will you know if you were successful? How do you measure your success with this? How will you know when you've made it?
And that's one I've learned as a coach is really important, is a lot of the leaders you're working with are very used to different KPIs and operational metrics. This is a new area for them. And so really pushing them to say, okay, we can track completion of a goal or action steps as progress. You can also capture stories. In the next 30 days, I will have 3 stories about where I've provided one-on-one feedback to my team. And so they're often looking for a coach to help them surface success measurements and ways to track progress.
Yeah. Here's a better action plan. I don't know if it's a perfect action plan. There's not enough room on this page, maybe. Well, that's my excuse. This could be a little more specific, but we're saying I'm going to improve both the quality and the frequency of feedback provided to my team. I'm going to improve both of those areas, and this is what I'm going to do. First thing I'm going to do is establish weekly one-on-ones. I can do that within the week. Establish a time for me to meet with each of my direct reports. I'm going to set the expectation with the team. I'm going to tell them they're going to receive feedback in their one-on-one each week. Now you've got upward accountability. Now they're expecting to see feedback in that conversation. So now you're a little more motivated to give it because everybody has the expectation and they're waiting for that feedback. You're also going to schedule in 10 minutes before each one-on-one, each check-in, to plan out what's the feedback I'm going to give and how am I going to give it. Use 5 minutes during the session to provide feedback. And then after each session, you're going to evaluate what went well and what can be improved. So now we're measuring the success. It's qualitative. We're measuring it. And we're also introducing an additional accountability partner because we're telling our manager about this. And we're going to review the successes and struggles each week. And we're going to get some qualitative measurement there as well. But we can also measure that we've done the process as well. And by the way, all of these action plans should be subject to change. If it's not working for you, then you may need to add something to this plan. 2 weeks in, you might say, I really need to add mentoring to this. I'm going to get a mentor who's really great at feedback. We're going to do some role playing. That could be added to this sort of an action plan. But this is a little more specific, a little more time bound, has a little more accountability built in. So it's a better action plan. That's all we have to talk about. Unfortunately, with an hour session, we can't tell everything that we know about coaching. I think if we had an hour and 10 minutes, maybe I could have told you everything. I got maybe 10 more minutes worth of information I know about coaching, but we can't tell you everything. Here's just a quick summary. Understand your role as a coach. Are you a therapist? Probably not. You're probably not a consultant. What we really want you to be is a coach. Stay curious, present, and create safety in those conversations. Reframe the conversation to focus up on what's most important. And then help clients prioritize down to 1, 2, maybe 3 major areas for them to focus on. And then ask good questions that can help clients in the action planning process.
Great. Dave and Christian, this has been amazing. Thank you so much for sharing. First question that came that I want to address is, must be a larger organization trying to do 360s organizational wide, worried about coaching everyone. They have a lot of people going through 360s, and how do they coach everyone and help them through that process?
Yeah, there's some great options we have around that. What that we found to be productive. One that we love to do is group sessions. So for 360s, there's a way to do a group debrief. Well, obviously, there's some trade-offs. You get some scale, but you're not able to ask those one-on-one discovery questions to the same extent. So group sessions where you're doing a group debrief. This is a report walking through some of the basics, some healthy attitudes and broad Q&A, and then shorter follow-up sessions can be productive there. And then very quickly, I found in those type of group exercises, the individuals that need some more focus will become apparent pretty quick, especially if you're doing those shorter follow-ups. A half hour one-on-one will kind of lead to, okay, this person has some additional time. And so you can kind of work that way. The other approach is, obviously we're fans of leveraging external coaches and we do that work, but also certifying more people. So even get creative with that. A lot of folks in HR, of course, are interested in becoming certified in 360 coaching and building some proficiency there, but also let other leaders in the organization take an interest in this. So even if they're not aligned with HR, you can build a coaching network within your organization and leverage people that have an interest in it, a natural ability and some time to build some internal capacity.
Yeah, I really love the group coaching sessions because, and the way that we do it at DecisionWise is to really keep them high in participation, make sure that we're bringing out conversation and making sure that the audience is participating in that conversation, and we're giving them time to reflect. So we ask them the same questions. What are your one or two things that you want to work on over the next year? And we give them time to write that down and think about it and reflect. And so we make it very participative. We're not just going through a report and saying, this is what this is and this is what that is. We're actually walking them through how to review the report and how to get the most out of it, how to prioritize, how to action plan. So I love those sessions. The other thing that you could do if you're really doing kind of an organizational rollout is to have managers serve as your debriefers. Now, it's not always going to be perceived as safe,
right.
Especially if there's a bad relationship to a manager and an employee. But if you're really rolling it out to everybody, then having managers participate in that can be a way to scale. But I do love the group debrief. I love Christian's suggestion, which is to certify more people in the organization. Just make sure you have capacity or even bring in external coaches.
Great. I'm going to try to combine a couple of these together. So somebody asked about a senior leader who had a meltdown after seeing their results. How do you manage through that and help them because they were frustrated because somebody didn't say it right to their face, even though they may have, and they just weren't listening. And so then the second part of that is somebody comes back with a situation where they might need additional coaching.
I can answer the first. I think that when you have somebody that receives a report that is having a meltdown, that is the number one reason why you would need a coach. Yep. To come in and start walking them through that. It's just exactly that Sarah model. If someone is stuck in anger, it can be really helpful to come in and ask some thought-provoking questions that gets them out of their fight or flight, and in this case, fight place of the brain, and get them into the critical thinking part of the brain to say, hey, look, there's a way to prioritize this in a way that it doesn't seem so overwhelming. I've had lots of situations where people come in angry, but I don't know that I've ever had a situation where somebody stays permanently angry, right, where we're not able to kind of access the rational part of their brain and start talking through, okay, let's focus on the future. Oftentimes that perspective is because I'm focused heavily on what's happened in the past. And I like to say that I'm focused on what's happening in the rearview mirror instead of what's happening in front of me through the windshield. I want to make sure that I'm getting them focused for the future. Okay, what can we do now? As opposed to how are we going to create retribution on the things that people have said in the past.
And I'll just add to that. The meltdown is actually itself is the evidence that kind of helps support the growth. There's the quote, if you can name the game, you can decide if you want to play. So if you feel that the client is in an angry place, you address that and say, is it possible that the strong type of reaction is the reason people aren't coming to you with feedback? And so to Dave's point, some thought-provoking questions in the moment just really unlock that and can tap into that logical, more rational side. But it is an art. You get better at it, more comfortable with it over time.
Great. I'm going to answer the next question. Do we teach a course on how to interpret the 360 to truly become an expert? The answer is yes. Dave and Christian are both instrumental in teaching those courses. Dave, I'm going to have you answer this next one because I know you spent a lot of time with this. What are your thoughts about organizations creating their own 360s? And yes, maybe even talk about how that can be done in the DecisionWise 360 platform.
Yeah, I think it is something I've had experience with. I think one of the things that we've done historically, and maybe when we first started doing 360s a really long time ago, was to kind of create a standard competency model or standard assessment by which we would judge all leaders in all organizations and say these are generally virtuous behaviors and competencies that we want our leaders to have. And so it would be applicable across all different organizations. What we found and what we're finding more and more every day is that if an organization wants to affect change in their culture, they really need to define, okay, so what does that mean for the behaviors and practices and competencies that our leaders need to aspire to and actually attain to in order for us to implement said culture. And so it's kind of the how of how we change culture in each individual leader. And it's an expectation for leadership that we set on the entire organization. And so the more we've done that, and our first time into this was maybe 5 or 6 years ago, we started creating more of a library of competencies where an organization can come to us and work in our 360 tool and say, look, here's 80 competencies. What are the ones that are most salient to you or most important to you in terms of getting your culture to where you want to be? What's the expectation that you want to set for your leaders? And let's define that piece by piece by bringing in these different competencies. And let's create a model for your organization of great leadership. And then we can use that model to create the assessment that you'll be assessing your leaders. And that's a great model for organizational change.
When it's done right, it's absolutely the best thing to have a custom 360 for your organization. Not that should stop you from running 360s, because there's really great off-the-shelf models, but ultimately it's much better if it's tailored to the org.
Yeah, it allows you to define what's your culture going to be.
Yep.
That's great. Christian, I want to end with this question. Put your consultant hat on here, right? What is the most important piece of advice you have for coaches that have a hard time having real conversations and feel uncomfortable coaching employees that aren't performing? And Christian's probably going to say something like, tell them dad jokes or something.
Yeah, no, I was going to say, I have a ring that says, what would Dave do? And I just try to emulate my role model there. No, I would go back to those basic principles. So stay present, stay curious. Even when the emotional stakes seem very high, I would also keep it very much about the report. Here's what I'm seeing. Here's what I'm noticing in your reaction. And I would ask really good questions. I guess there's more than one piece. So if I had to distill it to one, it would be this. What's the question I can ask to further the situation, to help the situation progress to a healthy place? So if it's an emotional reaction or if it's resistance, I might ask a question like, what's the consequence if you continue down this? And just try to get the person thinking through where they're headed. If this is the experience they're creating for others, we have evidence of it in the report. And if we don't change, where are we headed? A question like that usually changes the tone and opens it up. And so that's the piece of advice I'd have, is what question can I ask next to further the situation?
Great. Dave and Christian, thank you again so much. And thank you everyone for taking the time to watch this webinar, and have a great rest of your day.